Don't just watch in the dark. Click subscribe, like, and join now. Before we begin, tell me, where are you listening from and what time is it there? The Book That Called Me. The streets of Chicago were slick with rain, reflecting the dim orange glow of streetlights like shattered mirrors. It was 5 in the morning, and the city seemed to hold its breath under a heavy sky streaked with gray clouds. The storm had rolled in from Lake Michigan without warning, drenching everything in sight. Victoria Evans stood on the corner of Wabash Avenue, clutching her coat tighter around herself as she waited for the traffic light to change. She hated mornings like this, cold, wet, and eerily quiet, but her job at the library demanded punctuality. Victoria worked at Harold Washington Library Center, a towering structure that loomed over South State Street like some ancient sentinel. The building's glass facade shimmered faintly in the pre-dawn gloom, catching the occasional flash of lightning that lit up the horizon. As she approached the entrance, her shoes squelching against the wet pavement, she noticed something odd: a single book lying face down on the steps leading up to the main doors. Its cover was dark, almost black, and water pooled around it in tiny rivulets. No one else was around. The security guard, who usually manned the early shift, hadn't arrived yet. She hesitated for a moment before picking it up. The book felt heavier than it should have been, its pages damp but not entirely soaked through. There was no title on the spine or cover, just an embossed pattern of swirling lines that seemed to shift slightly when viewed from different angles. A shiver ran down her spine, though she couldn't say why. Maybe it was the way the book felt. Alive somehow, pulsing faintly in her hands. Still, curiosity got the better of her. She tucked it under her arm and pushed open the heavy glass door. Inside, the library was silent except for the faint hum of fluorescent lights overhead. Rows upon rows of shelves stretched out into shadowy corners, their contents neatly organized, yet somehow foreboding in the dim light. Victoria made her way to the circulation desk near the center of the atrium, setting the book down carefully, as if afraid it might bite. Her fingers lingered on the cover for a second longer than necessary before she pulled them away abruptly. Something about it unsettled her deeply, though she couldn't put her finger on what exactly it was. Her co-worker, Daniel Harris, arrived shortly after, yawning loudly as he shuffled toward the desk. He was tall and lanky, with messy brown hair that stuck out in all directions despite his best efforts to tame it. "Morning, Vic," he muttered, glancing briefly at the book before shrugging. "What's this?" "I found it outside," Victoria replied, keeping her voice low so as not to disturb the stillness. "It doesn't have a title or anything." Daniel raised an eyebrow but didn't comment further. Instead, he reached out to touch the book, his hand hovering above it for a moment before making contact. His expression changed instantly from mild curiosity to outright alarm. "Whoa, this thing is freezing." Victoria nodded, though she hadn't thought much of the temperature earlier. Now that Daniel mentioned it, the air around the book did seem colder, almost unnaturally so. She watched as he flipped it open cautiously, revealing blank pages that looked yellowed with age despite being completely dry, or at least they appeared blank at first glance. When Daniel tilted the book slightly toward the light, faint words began to emerge, written in ink that shimmered like oil slicks. They weren't English or any language Victoria recognized, but the shapes twisted and writhed across the page as if trying to escape the confines of the paper. "This is messed up," Daniel whispered, snapping the book shut quickly. He glanced around nervously, as if expecting someone or something to appear from the shadows. "We should probably report this to management." But Victoria shook her head firmly. "Not yet. Let me look at it again." She wasn't sure why, but the book called to her in a way she couldn't explain. It wasn't just curiosity anymore, it was compulsion, a gnawing need to understand what lay within those shifting symbols. Reluctantly, Daniel handed it back to her, muttering something about coffee before disappearing into the staff lounge. Alone now, Victoria opened the book once more. This time, the sensation was stronger, the weight of unseen eyes watching her every move. The text seemed clearer too, forming jagged patterns that pulsed rhythmically, almost like a heartbeat. Without realizing it, she leaned closer, her nose nearly brushing the surface of the page. And then she heard it, a whisper, soft and insidious, threading itself into her thoughts. It wasn't audible in the traditional sense, more like a memory surfacing unbidden. The voice spoke in fragments, disjointed phrases that coalesced into meaning only when she focused hard enough. "Find me," it said. "Free me." Startled, Victoria slammed the book shut, her heart pounding wildly in her chest. Had Daniel heard it? Was she imagining things? She glanced toward the staff lounge, half expecting him to come running out, but there was no sign of him, just silence and the oppressive weight of the library closing in around her. For the rest of the day, Victoria tried to focus on her duties, shelving returned books and assisting patrons with research queries. But the presence of the mysterious volume weighed heavily on her mind. It sat on the edge of her desk, seemingly innocuous, yet impossible to ignore. Every time she passed by, she swore she could feel it humming softly, vibrating with suppressed energy. By late afternoon, the temptation became unbearable. She locked herself in the staff break room, determined to decipher even a fraction of what the book contained. The whispers returned almost immediately, louder this time, overlapping each other until they formed a cacophony of voices. Some pleaded for help, others screamed in agony, while a few laughed maniacally. Victoria pressed her palms against her ears, shaking her head violently to block them out. But the sound wasn't external, it came from inside her own skull, burrowing deeper with each passing second. Tears streamed down her face as she forced herself to concentrate, tracing the intricate patterns on the page with trembling fingers. Slowly, painstakingly, the symbols began to rearrange themselves, forming words she could finally understand. "They seek you," the text read. "They hunger." Before she could process what it meant, the lights flickered violently, plunging the room into darkness. A low rumble echoed through the building, like distant thunder, but somehow wrong, unnatural. Victoria scrambled to her feet, clutching the book tightly as she fumbled for the doorknob. When she stepped back into the main hall, the atmosphere had shifted dramatically. Shadows danced along the walls where none should exist, twisting and contorting into grotesque shapes. The air smelled metallic, tinged with decay. And worst of all, the silence was gone, replaced by faint scratching sounds, like claws dragging across wood. "Daniel?" she called out, her voice cracking with fear. No response. Panic rising, she moved toward the circulation desk, hoping to find some semblance of safety there. But as she rounded the corner, she froze. The shelves lining the aisles were no longer filled with books, they were empty, hollow husks stretching endlessly into the gloom. Where had everything gone? What was happening? A sudden movement caught her eye, a figure darting between the rows ahead. It was small, hunched over, moving with jerky, unnatural motions. Victoria backed away instinctively, clutching the book to her chest like a shield. The figure stopped abruptly, turning to face her. Its head tilted sideways, impossibly far, joints cracking audibly. Then it lunged. She screamed, stumbling backward as the creature skittered forward on all fours, its limbs elongated and spider-like. Its face, if it could be called that, was featureless save for a gaping maw lined with needle-sharp teeth. The thing moved faster than she thought possible, closing the distance between them in seconds. Just as it leapt toward her, Victoria threw the book at it in desperation. The impact sent it sprawling, screeching in pain as smoke rose from where the tome had struck its body. Seizing the opportunity, she bolted toward the exit. Outside, the rain had intensified, soaking her instantly as she sprinted down the steps. Thunder boomed overhead, drowning out the sound of her frantic footsteps. She didn't stop running until she reached her car, slamming the door shut behind her and locking it with shaking hands. Breathing heavily, she glanced at the passenger seat and froze. The book sat there, dripping wet, its cover cracked open slightly to reveal glowing symbols etched onto the inner pages. "No," she whispered, reaching out tentatively. "How did you?" The car rocked violently as something slammed into the roof, denting the metal inward. Another crash followed, then another, accompanied by guttural growls that reverberated through the vehicle. Victoria ducked low, covering her head as shards of glass rained down from the shattered windshield. Through the chaos, she saw the library in the distance, its windows pulsing with sickly green light. The book vibrated fiercely in her lap, urging her to return. Against her better judgment, she obeyed. Back inside, the scene had changed again. The aisles were intact now, stocked with books as if nothing had happened, yet the oppressive feeling lingered, thicker than ever. The whispers grew louder, converging into a single voice that spoke directly to her. "You cannot run," it hissed. "You are mine now." Victoria spun around, searching for the source, but found only emptiness. Until she saw him, the man standing at the end of the aisle, partially obscured by shadows. He wore a tattered suit, his skin pale and translucent, eyes sunken and hollow. In his skeletal hands, he held a copy of the same book she carried. "Michael Parker," he rasped, taking a step closer. "I've been waiting." And then the world dissolved into darkness. When Victoria awoke, hours later, she was seated at the circulation desk. The library was empty, bathed in the golden light of dawn filtering through the windows. For a moment, she thought it had all been a nightmare. But when she looked down, the book lay open before her, its pages filled with fresh writing. "They will come for you next." Slender Man Stalked My Family. It was a summer evening in the small town of Willow Creek, nestled deep within the dense forests of Maine. The sun had dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the landscape and painting the sky with hues of orange and purple. At 8:30 p.m., the air was cool but humid, carrying with it the earthy scent of pine trees and damp soil. Inside their modest home on Maple Lane, the Thompson family, Michael, his wife Emily, and their two children, 8-year-old Jake and 5-year-old Lily, were settling in for the night. The house itself was unremarkable, a typical suburban dwelling with white walls, wooden floors, and large windows that offered a view of the sprawling forest behind their property. But tonight, those windows would become more than just glass pans. They would serve as portals to something far darker, lurking beyond the tree line. Little did the Thompsons know, their peaceful evening was about to take a terrifying turn. As Michael sat at the kitchen table grading papers from his job as a high school teacher, Emily busied herself washing dishes in the sink. Jake and Lily played quietly in the living room, giggling as they built a tower out of blocks. The atmosphere was calm, almost serene, until Jake suddenly froze mid-laugh. His wide eyes stared intently toward the window beside him, his little hands clutching the block tightly. "Mom? Dad?" He called out hesitantly, his voice trembling slightly. Is someone outside?" Emily turned around quickly, her heart skipping a beat as she followed her son's gaze. At first glance, nothing seemed amiss. The trees swayed gently in the breeze, and the only sounds were the chirping crickets and rustling leaves. But then, faintly etched against the fading light of dusk, stood a figure. Tall, impossibly so, with limbs that stretched unnaturally long and thin. Its face was obscured by darkness, but its presence radiated an undeniable menace. Emily gasped, dropping the dish she held, which shattered noisily on the floor. "Who's there?" Michael demanded, rushing into the living room. He grabbed the flashlight resting near the door, flicking it on instinctively. The beam of light illuminated the yard, revealing nothing but empty space where the figure had been moments before. Yet, despite its disappearance, the sense of unease remained palpable, hanging heavy in the air like a storm cloud ready to unleash chaos. Jake clung to Emily's leg, tears streaming down his cheeks as he whispered, "He was watching us." He looked right at me. Lily, too young to fully grasp what was happening, simply hugged her brother tightly, her own fear mirroring his. Michael scanned the perimeter through the windows again, his jaw clenched tightly. "Stay inside," he instructed firmly. "I'll check around the house." Grabbing a baseball bat from the garage, Michael ventured cautiously into the backyard. The moon had risen higher now, bathing the area in silvery light. Every shadow appeared sinister, every movement suspicious. As he rounded the corner of the house, his breath caught in his throat. There, standing motionless beneath the towering oak tree, was the figure once again. It made no sound, no gesture, just stood there, its elongated arms hanging limply at its sides, staring directly at him. Michael stumbled backward, nearly dropping the bat as panic surged through his veins. "What do you want?" he shouted, his voice shaking despite his efforts to sound brave. The figure didn't respond, nor did it move closer. Instead, it tilted its head slightly, an action so unnatural it sent shivers down Michael's spine. Without waiting for another moment, he sprinted back inside, slamming the door shut behind him and locking it securely. Inside, the family huddled together in the living room, hearts pounding wildly. "We need to call the police," Emily suggested, reaching for her phone. But when she dialed, the line was dead, no signal, no connection. Panic began to spread like wildfire among them. "Try the landline," Michael urged, already moving furniture to barricade the front door. Emily did as instructed, but the result was the same haunting dial tone greeted her instead of a live operator. Hours passed, each one feeling like an eternity. The family took turns peering out the windows, searching for any sign of the mysterious figure. Occasionally, they caught glimpses of movement, always fleeting, always just enough to keep them on edge. By midnight, exhaustion started to set in, but sleep was impossible. The tension in the air was suffocating, pressing down on them with relentless intensity. Around 2:00 a.m., Lily woke up crying, claiming she saw the figure staring at her through her bedroom window. Emily rushed to comfort her, bundling her into her arms and bringing her downstairs to join the rest of the family. Together, they formed a tight circle, drawing strength from one another's presence. Michael lit candles, hoping the warm glow might provide some semblance of comfort, though deep down, none of them believed it could truly ward off whatever evil prowled outside. Just after dawn broke, casting golden rays of sunlight across the landscape, the figure finally disappeared. Whether it retreated due to the approaching day or merely chose to vanish, none of the Thompsons knew. What they did know was that their lives had changed irrevocably. That night marked the beginning of a series of unsettling events, strange noises in the attic, missing items appearing in odd places, and eerie whispers echoing through the halls when no one else was present. Days turned into weeks, and the phenomenon persisted. Desperate for answers, the Thompsons sought help from local authorities, paranormal investigators, and even religious leaders. Some dismissed their claims as mere imagination or stress-induced hallucinations, while others listened intently, recognizing patterns similar to cases documented throughout history involving entities known colloquially as Slender Man. Despite their skepticism, all agreed on one thing: the family needed to leave Willow Creek immediately. Reluctantly, the Thompsons packed up their belongings and moved to a new town hundreds of miles away. They hoped distance would sever the connection between them and the entity that haunted their former home. For a time, peace returned to their lives. Jake and Lily adjusted to their new surroundings, making friends and finding joy in everyday activities. Michael resumed teaching, while Emily found solace in volunteer work at a community center. But the respite was short-lived. One fateful evening, as the family gathered for dinner in their new home, Jake mentioned seeing a tall man outside his window. This time, the figure wasn't wearing a suit, it wore nothing at all, blending seamlessly with the shadows cast by the setting sun. Emily dropped her fork, her hand flying to cover her mouth as realization dawned upon her. No matter how far they ran, no matter how hard they tried to escape, the entity continued to stalk them, drawn inexorably to their family by forces neither science nor religion could explain. Years later, the Thompsons still carry the burden of that encounter. They speak sparingly about it, choosing instead to focus on building a life free from fear. Yet, every now and then, during quiet nights when the world seems most still, Michael glances nervously out the window, searching for signs of movement among the trees. And though he tells himself repeatedly that it's over, deep down, he can't help but wonder if the Slender Man is still out there watching, waiting, planning his next move. Next story. The Unsolved Case of Room 606. The Hotel Room That Never Existed. I never thought I'd be sitting here telling you this story. It's not something anyone would believe if they hadn't experienced it themselves. But the truth is, some things in life are too strange to ignore. and room 606 was one of them. Let me start from the beginning. It all began with a phone call late one night, a voice on the other end that sounded like someone trying desperately to warn me about something I couldn't yet understand. "Don't go there," it whispered before disconnecting abruptly. At first, I dismissed it as a prank or just another sleepless night getting the better of me. But then, the emails started coming. Anonymous messages filled with cryptic warnings. "Room 606 doesn't exist, but it will find you." The more I tried to ignore them, the louder they became. And eventually, curiosity got the better of me. You see, I'm a journalist by trade, and stories like these are my bread and butter. Urban legends, unsolved mysteries, they're what keep me up at night, both figuratively and literally. So when I stumbled across an article online about a hotel called the Grand Elysian, nestled deep in the heart of a small town no one had ever heard of, I knew I had to investigate further. According to local lore, the Grand Elysian wasn't just any ordinary hotel, it was infamous for its mysterious past. Guests reported hearing whispers through the walls, feeling cold spots where none should exist, and even seeing shadows moving in places they shouldn't. But what intrigued me most was the legend surrounding room 606. Some said it didn't exist at all, that it had been sealed off decades ago after a series of disappearances left investigators baffled. Others claimed it still existed, hidden away behind locked doors, waiting for those foolish enough to seek it out. And so, armed with nothing but my notebook, a flashlight, and a healthy dose of skepticism, I booked myself a room at the Grand Elysian. Little did I know how much that decision would change my life forever. When I arrived, the hotel looked every bit as eerie as the stories suggested. Its towering facade loomed over the street, its windows dark, except for a few scattered lights flickering faintly in the distance. The air smelled faintly of mildew and old wood, and the heavy oak doors creaked ominously as I pushed them open. A bell rang somewhere inside, echoing down the long corridors beyond. At the front desk sat an elderly man whose eyes seemed to pierce right through me. He introduced himself simply as Mr. Grayson, though his name tag bore no such title. His fingers trembled slightly as he handed me my keycard, and his voice carried a weight that made me feel uneasy. "You're staying in room 412, he said without looking up. "4th floor. Elevators around the corner." I nodded, thanking him politely, though his demeanor left me unsettled. As I turned to leave, I noticed a peculiar gap between two panels on the wall behind him. For a moment, I thought I saw a Movementa shadow darting into the darkness, but when I blinked, it was gone. The elevator ride up felt longer than it should have. Each ding announcing our arrival at a new floor sent shivers down my spine. By the time I reached the 4th floor, the hallway stretched out before me like a labyrinth, its carpet worn thin and stained in places. The lighting flickered erratically, casting odd shapes against the peeling wallpaper. Somewhere in the distance, I could hear faint footsteps, though I was clearly alone. My room was exactly as described. Sparse furnishings, outdated decor, and a window offering a view of nothing but brick walls. Yet despite its unremarkable appearance, something about the space made me uncomfortable. The silence pressed heavily on my ears, and I swore I could feel eyes watching me from outside. That evening, I decided to explore the hotel further. After all, I hadn't come here just to sit in my room. Armed with my notebook, I wandered aimlessly through the corridors, taking note of their peculiarities. Hallways twisted and turned in ways that defied logic, leading me back to places I'd already been. Doors appeared where none had existed moments before, only to vanish again once I approached. It was maddening and utterly fascinating. Then came the whispers. At first, I thought they were coming from within my own mind, echoes of paranoia brought on by the oppressive atmosphere. But soon, I realized they weren't imagined. They were real soft murmurs drifting through the vents, voices speaking languages I couldn't recognize. My heart raced as I followed the sound, drawn deeper into the bowels of the building. And then, I found it. Room 606. The door stood at the end of a particularly narrow corridor, its number etched into the metal frame in faded gold letters. It looked out of place among the other rooms, almost as though it didn't belong. Yet there it was, staring back at me like a silent sentinel guarding secrets best left buried. For a moment, I hesitated. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, to walk away while I still could. But curiosity, or perhaps fate, compelled me forward. With trembling hands, I reached for the doorknob, turning it slowly. The lock clicked open with a sound that echoed unnaturally loud in the empty hall. Inside, the world shifted. Room 606 defied explanation. The walls seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting as though alive. Shadows danced across the floor in patterns that made no sense, and the furniture appeared to rearrange itself whenever I glanced away. Objects from different eras cluttered the space, a rotary phone sitting next to a modern laptop, antique vases standing beside plastic cups. Time itself felt distorted here, stretching and compressing until I couldn't tell whether minutes or hours had passed. But worst of all were the faces. In the mirrors lining the walls, reflections stared back at men my own, but those of strangers, men, women, children, all frozen in expressions of terror. Their lips moved silently, forming words I couldn't quite catch. And then, slowly, they began to speak. "Help us!" Their voices overlapped, creating a cacophony of pleas and warnings. My head throbbed painfully as I backed away, desperate to escape, but the door was gone. Where it had once stood now lay only a blank wall, smooth and impenetrable. Panic set in as I realized I was trapped. Hours or maybe days passed in that room, or perhaps no time at all. I lost count, unable to distinguish reality from nightmare. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, until they consumed everything. Memories surfaced unbidden, scenes from my past replaying endlessly in vivid detail, each recollection cut deeper than the last, unraveling threads of guilt and regret I thought long buried. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it ended. The room dissolved around me, replaced by the familiar sight of the hotel hallway. The door to room 606 hung open, though I couldn't recall leaving. Shaking uncontrollably, I stumbled back to my own room, collapsing onto the bed as tears streamed down my face. Days later, I returned home, determined to put the ordeal behind me. But the memories lingered, haunting me in ways I couldn't explain. When I tried to recount my experience to others, they dismissed it as nonsense. No one believed Minot, even myself sometimes. Records showed no mention of room 606. Employees denied its existence entirely. Yet deep down, I knew it was real. Because every night, as I lie awake in the dark, I can still hear the whispers calling my name. And sometimes, when I least expect it, I swear I see the number 606 carved into the walls of my own apartment.
Next story. Time didn't exist here, but I was still awake. Hello? Can anyone hear me? My name is Alex. This isn't going to make much sense at first, but I need to tell someone what happened, what's still happening. Because, if you're listening to this right now, then it might already be too late. It started with a walk, just a simple hike through the woods behind my house. You know how it goes, you take a shortcut home after work, or maybe you're trying to clear your head after a long day. That's all it was supposed to be, a quiet escape from reality. But something about that forest felt different today. Wrong, almost. The air smelled stale, like it hadn't moved in years. The trees stood unnaturally still, their branches twisted into shapes that looked more like claws than growth patterns, and there were no birds. No insects buzzing around me, just silence. Thick, heavy silence. I should have turned back when I noticed the first sign, but who could have guessed? Let me rewind for a moment and explain exactly where everything went sideways. So here's the thing about forests, they all look the same at first glance. Tall trunks, dense canopies, patches of sunlight filtering down through gaps above. It's easy to think you're heading somewhere familiar until you realize you're not. I stumbled upon a trail I'd never seen before, or at least I don't remember seeing it. It wasn't marked on any maps I'd ever studied, and yet there it was, a narrow dirt path winding deeper into the woods, lined with moss-covered stones. My curiosity got the better of me, as it always does. Before I knew it, I was following the trail farther and farther away from civilization. At first, nothing seemed unusual. The sun cast golden beams across the forest floor, dappling the ground with light. Birds chirped softly in the distance. Everything appeared normal, almost peaceful. But then, things began to shift. The light stopped moving. Wait. Let me clarify, that doesn't mean the forest grew darker. Quite the opposite, actually. The sunlight stayed fixed in place, hovering over the exact same spot on the ground, hour after hour. At least, that's what it felt like. Hours passed or so, I thought, but the shadows refused to budge. They remained frozen, trapped in time itself. That's when I checked my phone, and found out it wasn't working. No signal, no GPS, not even the clock worked properly. The screen flickered, showing random times jumping forward and backward without rhyme or reason. 1 minute it said 3:47 p.m., the next 12:02 a.m. Then it froze entirely, stuck on 6:18 p.m. 16:18. Forever. Panic bubbled up inside me, but I forced myself to stay calm. Maybe it was just interference from the trees. Maybe I needed to climb higher to get reception. So I kept walking, hoping the trail would lead somewhere recognizable. Instead, it led me straight into the heart of madness. After what felt like hours or maybe minutes, I emerged onto a clearing unlike anything I'd ever seen. It was eerily beautiful, yet utterly unnatural. In the center stood an old clock tower, its hands frozen mid-strike. Around it lay remnants of a forgotten village, crumbling houses, rusted cars, abandoned playgrounds. All of them untouched by decay, as though preserved in amber. Yet no one lived here anymore, not a single soul stirred among the ruins. Only echoes lingered in the air-faint murmurs of laughter, crying children, distant conversations that faded before I could understand them, voices out of sync with reality. I called out, "Hello?" Nothing responded except my own voice bouncing off the dead walls. As I explored further, I realized the truth. Time had stopped completely in this place. Every object, every structure, every shadow remained exactly as it had been when the world outside moved on. Watches hung from wrists, their hands locked forever at odd angles. Pendulums swung endlessly within broken clocks, never completing their arcs. Even the clouds above appeared suspended mid-drift, their edges sharp and unmoving. And yet, I could move, I could breathe, I could think. How was that possible? That question haunted me as I wandered aimlessly through the ghost town. Why was I unaffected while everything else stood still? What made me special, or was I cursed? It didn't take long for the horrors to reveal themselves. At first, they were subtle, almost imperceptible, a glimpse of movement in the corner of my eye, a fleeting shadow darting between buildings. When I turned to investigate, nothing was there. Just empty streets and lifeless windows staring back at me. But then came the voices. Whispered fragments of sentences drifted toward me, overlapping and twisting into gibberish. Help. Please. You shouldn't be here. Each word sent chills down my spine, though none of them sounded human. More like echoes from another dimension, distorted beyond comprehension. Then came the figures. They weren't Pioplinot exactly. They were silhouettes etched into the fabric of reality, standing motionless in doorways, leaning against lampposts, crouching beneath staircases. Their forms shifted whenever I tried to focus on them, blurring into indistinct blobs of darkness, yet somehow I knew they were watching me. Watching and waiting. One nighter, what I assumed was night, I saw something truly terrifying. A man sat on a park bench near the fountain, his posture stiff and unnatural. His face was hidden beneath the brim of a wide hat, but his eyes gleamed with an otherworldly light. He stared straight at me, unmoving, unblinking. As I approached, he tilted his head slightly, revealing a mouth full of jagged teeth. Before I could scream, he vanished. Or maybe he didn't vanish. Maybe he simply became part of the background, blending seamlessly into the frozen tableau surrounding me. Either way, I couldn't shake the feeling that he and whatever else lurked here wasn't real. Not in the way I understood reality anyway. Days turned into weeks, or perhaps months. Without a functioning clock, it was impossible to tell. Time lost all meaning in this place. Hunger and thirst ceased to bother me. Sleep became unnecessary. My body adapted, or rather, it deteriorated. Slowly but surely, I began to lose pieces of myself. Memories faded. Faces blurred. Emotions dulled. The only constant was the creeping sensation of being watched. Always watched. Desperation drove me to try escaping over and over again. I retraced my steps along the trail that brought me here, only to find it looping back onto itself. Doors opened into brick walls. Windows showed reflections of places I'd never been. Maps crumbled to dust in my hands. Compasses spun wildly, refusing to point north. Eventually, I gave up trying to leave. There was nowhere to go, no one to save me. That's when the hallucinations started. At first, they were mild just flashes of color or strange smells wafting through the air. Then came the sounds, footsteps trailing behind me, doors creaking open, whispers growing louder in my ear. Finally, the visions arrived. People materialized out of thin air, reaching for me with clawed hands. Buildings twisted and warped, melting into grotesque caricatures of themselves. Trees sprouted faces, grinning malevolently as I passed. Was I losing my mind, or was this place feeding off my fears, manifesting them into tangible nightmares? One day, or maybe it was the same day, repeating endlessly, I stumbled upon a journal tucked inside a dusty bookshelf in one of the abandoned houses. Its pages were yellowed and brittle, filled with frantic scribbles detailing experiences identical to mine. The writer described finding the forest, entering the village, realizing they were trapped. Over time, their entries grew shorter, more desperate, until finally, "It knows I'm here." Those words echoed in my mind long after I closed the journal. Or, what was it? And why did it want us here? The answer hit me later, during another endless loop through the village. While examining the clock tower more closely, I noticed something I hadn't seen before: carvings etched into the stone base. Symbols resembling ancient runes spiraled upward, forming intricate patterns that pulsed faintly with an inner glow. As I touched them, visions flooded my mind. I saw others like medicines, hundreds, maybe thousands, Saul caught in this timeless prison. Some screamed, others wept. A few smiled serenely, accepting their fate. Each vision ended the same way, a figure cloaked in shadows stepping forward, pulling the victim into darkness. When the visions faded, I understood. This place wasn't meant to trap us, it was meant to harvest us. Our consciousness, our memories, our very essence fed whatever entity resided here. We were its fuel, sustaining its existence in a realm outside of time. And I was next. If you're hearing this, then I failed. Somehow, you found your way here just as I did. Please, don't make the same mistake. Find a way out. Leave immediately. Don't let it see you. Whatever you do, don't touch the symbols on the clock tower. I wish I could warn you more, but my time is running out, or rather, it's stopping altogether. The shadows are closing in. I can feel them dragging me under, pulling me apart piece by piece. Just promise me one thing. Tell someone about this place. Make sure they know it exists. Maybe someday, someone will figure out how to stop it. Goodbye.
Next story. The eyes behind the barn wall. The wall watched me back. It started with a letter, a plain white envelope that arrived at my door one morning, its edges worn and creased as though it had been passed through countless hands before reaching mine. My name was scrawled across the front in shaky handwriting letters, slanted and uneven, like they'd been written by someone who hadn't held a pen in years. Inside was even stranger. No greeting, no explanation, just a single sentence typed on yellowed paper. Take care of what's yours. Beneath it, an address I didn't recognize. I stared at the note for a long time, trying to figure out who would send me something so cryptic. Then I noticed the postmark came from a place called Willow Hollow, a tiny farming town nestled deep in the countryside, somewhere I'd never heard of until now. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those words again. Take care of what's yours. It felt personal, urgent even. By sunrise, curiosity or maybe something darker had won. I packed a bag, grabbed the keys to my car, and set off toward Willow Hollow. The drive took hours. The roads grew narrower the farther I went, twisting through dense forests and rolling fields dotted with cattle grazing lazily under the pale autumn sun. When I finally reached the address on the letter, I found myself staring at a crumbling farmhouse surrounded by overgrown weeds. The paint was peeling, windows cracked, and vines snaked their way up the sides of the house like veins spreading beneath skin. But it wasn't the house that caught my attention first. Off to the side, partially hidden behind tall grasses, stood the barn. An old red structure, faded but still standing tall against the weight of decades. There was something about it, something unsettling. Even from a distance, it seemed unnaturally quiet, as if everything around it had fallen silent just to let me notice it. As I approached, the air grew colder. Not the kind of chill you get from walking into shade, but deeper, heavier, like stepping into a memory you'd rather forget. The barn doors creaked open as I pushed them, revealing rows of dusty tools hanging crookedly on the walls, bales of hay stacked haphazardly in corners, and cobwebs strung between every beam. Everything smelled musty like damp wood and decay. For a moment, I hesitated. Something about this place made my stomach twist not fear exactly, but unease, a nagging feeling that I shouldn't be here. But then I remembered the letter. Whatever this was, it belonged to me now, and so I stepped inside. At first, nothing seemed unusual, just another abandoned barn, left to rot while the rest of the world moved on. But as I wandered further, inspecting each corner, I began to notice things. Small details that should have been ordinary, but weren't. Like how the animals avoided certain areas. Outside, birds chirped and squirrels darted among the trees, but near the barn, they vanished. Even flies stayed away, leaving patches of dead silence scattered throughout the interior, or how some of the tools looked almost wrong. Rust formed faster on certain pieces, eating away at metal until it crumbled beneath your touch. Others were perfectly preserved, gleaming despite years of neglect. And then there was the wall. It was located near the back, opposite the main entrance. At first glance, it looked like any other part of the barn roof-hewn planks nailed together, patched with newer wood where sections had rotted away. But when I stood close enough, I could feel it. A faint vibration, barely noticeable unless you were paying attention, like the wall itself was breathing or watching. I told myself I was being ridiculous. Old buildings settle, boards shift, wind whistles through cracks, it's all normal. Still, I couldn't shake the sensation that something was waiting behind that wall, watching me, waiting for me to turn around. Locals warned me about places like this. In the few days I spent exploring the property, I met several townsfolk who stopped by to introduce themselves or offer advice. Most spoke in hushed tones, glancing nervously at the barn whenever they mentioned it. "That barn was never right," said Mrs. Hargrove, a wiry woman with sharp eyes and a permanent frown. "People used to say strange things happened out there. Animals going missing, tools disappearing overnight. Best leave it alone if you ask me." Another man, Mr. Finch, nodded solemnly when I asked about the property. "I'd board it up if I were you," he muttered, avoiding eye contact. "Some places aren't meant to be fixed." Their warnings only fueled my curiosity. What could possibly make people so uneasy? Was it superstition or something more? It happened late one evening. I'd been working on clearing debris from the barn, hoping to salvage whatever materials I could find. As I leaned against the wall near the back, taking a break, I noticed something odd. One of the planks had shifted slightly, creating a thin crack in the wood. Through it, I could see darkness of void beyond the usual shadows cast by fading light. And then I saw them. Eyes. Two of them, glowing faintly in the gloom. Too large, too dark, and completely unnatural. They stared back at me, unblinking, as if daring me to look away. For a heartbeat, I froze, unable to move or speak. Then instinct kicked in, and I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over a pile of hay. When I turned back, the eyes were gone. The plank had slid back into place, sealing the gap once more. But I knew what I'd seen, knew it down to my bones. That night, I lay awake in the farmhouse, replaying the scene over and over in my mind. Maybe it was just Tricaria reflection of moonlight, or perhaps my imagination running wild after hearing all those stories. But deep down, I knew better. Those eyes hadn't been human. They hadn't been alive. From that point on, paranoia became my constant companion. Everywhere I went, I felt watched. Shadows stretched longer than they should have, whispers echoed through empty rooms, and sometimes I swore I could hear faint scratching sounds coming from the walls themselves. Each day brought new discoveries. Drawings carved into the barn, beam-screwed depictions of eyes, faces, figures twisted into impossible shapes. Splinters embedded in my skin without explanation, appearing randomly on my arms or legs as though the wood itself had reached out to mark me. Once, I woke up to find claw-like marks etched into the floorboards of the farmhouse, leading directly to the barn door. No matter how hard I tried to ignore it, the pull remained. That wall, Those eyes. They haunted me, calling me back like a siren song luring sailors to their doom. Eventually, I gave in. Armed with a crowbar, I returned to the barn determined to uncover the truth. If something was hiding behind that wall, I needed to face it head on. With trembling hands, I pried loose the plank where I'd seen the eyes. Wood splintered and groaned as it came free, revealing a narrow opening. Nothing, just darkness. No eyes this time, no movement, no sound. Only stale air that tasted metallic, like blood. I reached inside cautiously, half expecting to feel something grab me. Instead, my fingers brushed against rough stone. Beyond the wood paneling lay another Layeran inner wall constructed of jagged rocks mortared together haphazardly. Puzzled, I examined it closer. This wasn't part of the original structure. It had been added later, deliberately concealing whatever lay beyond. Determined to dig deeper, I worked tirelessly, removing plank after plank until the entire section of the wall was exposed. Layer upon layer revealed itself, each one older and more decrepit than the last. Modern wood gave way to ancient timber, which in turn led to stone, then dirt, then something else. Beneath the final layer, I uncovered a cavity filled with blackness, so absolute it seemed to swallow the light around it, and within that void, the eyes reappeared. Larger now, closer, pressing against the barrier as though testing its strength. They blinked this Timonot naturally, but deliberately, as if mocking me. A low, guttural whisper filled the air, vibrating through my chest. Words I couldn't understand, yet somehow knew their meaning. Fear, hunger, desire. Before I could retreat, the wall shuddered. Cracks spiderwebbed across the surface, widening with alarming speed. From one fissure, a hand emerged, pale and skeletal, fingers curling as if reaching for me. I stumbled back, dropping the crowbar as terror gripped my throat. The hand disappeared as quickly as it had come, retreating into the darkness. But the eyes remained, glaring at me with an intensity that burned like fire. They didn't blink anymore, didn't need to. After that night, everything changed. Sleep eluded me, replaced by fragmented dreams of endless walls stretching into infinity. In them, I stood frozen as the eyes multiplied, growing larger and closer until they consumed everything. When I woke, I often found myself standing outside the barn, staring blankly at the wall as though drawn there against my will. Obsession consumed me. Each day, I returned to the barn, chipping away at the wall piece by piece, driven by a compulsion I couldn't explain. Sometimes, I thought I caught glimpses of myself reflected in the cracks and it wasn't me. Not entirely. My face distorted, elongated, features warped into something monstrous. One evening, I realized I hadn't eaten or slept in days. My body ached, muscles twitching uncontrollably, yet I couldn't stop. The wall demanded my attention, its presence overwhelming every thought, every action, and those eyes, they followed me everywhere now, even when I wasn't near the barn. Blinking, shifting, always watching. Finally, I broke through. The last plank fell away, revealing a space devoid of anything familiar. No stone, no dirt, no wood, just blackness, pulsating and alive. The eyes swarmed toward me, filling the void like stars in a midnight sky. Whispers surged louder, drowning out rational thought, pulling me forward step by step. I don't remember much after that, only fragments. the sensation of falling, weightless and infinite. Voices speaking in tongues I couldn't comprehend. Light erupting from the darkness, blinding and eternal. When I came to, I was lying in the barn, surrounded by shattered wood and rubble. My hands were raw, bleeding, nails torn to shreds. Across from me, the wall stood intact once more, seamless and unbroken as if nothing had ever happened. But something had. Because when I stood and turned to leave, I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the cracked window pane. And the eyes staring back weren't mine. They never had been. The room behind the wall. Rain poured relentlessly over Anchorage as Daniel Harris drove through the deserted streets of the city just before dawn. The windshield wipers struggled to keep up with the deluge, while his headlights barely pierced the darkness, reflecting off the slick asphalt where puddles grew larger by the minute. He had moved to Alaska 3 months ago, seeking a fresh start after his divorce, finding solace in the isolation and cold weather that matched his mood. His new job at the local library kept him busy during the day, but the nights were long and lonely in his rented apartment on the outskirts of town. Daniel gripped the steering wheel tighter as he turned onto his street, noticing something unusual about his building. The third-floor window of his apartment was illuminated, though he distinctly remembered turning off all the lights before leaving for his early morning drive. A chill ran down his spine that had nothing to do with the Alaskan spring air seeping through the car's vents. He parked and sat for a moment, watching the rain streak down his windshield while debating whether to call the police or investigate himself. The rational part of his mind told him it was probably just a blown fuse or faulty wiring, but something about the yellow glow emanating from behind the curtains felt wrong. As he stepped out of the car, the cold rain immediately soaked through his jacket, and he could feel the water pooling in his shoes. The street was eerily silent except for the sound of rain hitting every available surface. No other cars passed by, no neighbors peeked out their windows. It was as if the entire neighborhood had been abandoned except for him and whatever waited inside his apartment. Reaching his door, he hesitated before inserting the key. The lock turned smoothly, too smoothly, as if someone had recently oiled it. Pushing the door open slowly, he called out, "Hello?" Though his voice barely rose above a whisper. The hallway light was on, which he definitely hadn't left that way. His heart pounded in his chest as he stepped inside, closing the door behind him with a soft click. The apartment seemed undisturbed at first glance. His coat still hung on the rack, his shoes remained neatly by the entrance, but something felt fundamentally different about the space. As he moved further into the living room, he noticed small details that sent warning signals through his mind. The books on his coffee table were slightly askew, not dramatically so, but enough to suggest they'd been handled recently. His laptop, which he always closed when leaving, was open and displaying the screensaver. More disturbingly, there was a faint smell in the air, something metallic and organic that made his stomach churn. It wasn't quite blood, but it carried the same primal warning that danger had been here, lingered, and might return at any moment. The bedroom door was ajar, and against his better judgment, Daniel pushed it open wider. Everything appeared normal until he noticed the closet door was slightly open, revealing a shadowy gap between the wall and the frame. He never left that door open, not since moving in. As he approached, he heard a soft creak from somewhere deep within the walls, like wood settling but with an unnatural rhythm. The sound repeated itself, growing louder and more insistent, then stopped abruptly. His breath caught in his throat as he realized the noise wasn't coming from the building's old structure, but rather from behind the wall itself. The next morning, Victoria Evans arrived at Daniel's apartment complex for their scheduled meeting. They had connected through a local support group for newcomers to Anchorage, bonding over their shared experiences of adjusting to life in Alaska. She stood outside his door, knocking repeatedly while checking her watch. The rain had lessened to a drizzle, but dark clouds still pressed heavily against the sky. When there was no answer after several minutes, she tried the door handle and found it unlocked. Inside, the apartment was deathly quiet, with an oppressive atmosphere that made her skin crawl despite the warmth of the heating system. Victoria called out Daniel's name as she entered, immediately noticing the same subtle signs of disturbance he had observed earlier. On the kitchen counter, she spotted his phone charger still plugged in, its cord coiled neatly, evidence that he hadn't planned to be gone long. In the living room, the books on the coffee table caught her attention. She recognized some of the titles. They were ones Daniel had mentioned reading recently, but now they seemed arranged in a pattern that suggested deliberate placement rather than casual browsing. Her unease grew as she noticed scuff marks on the carpet leading toward the bedroom. In the bedroom, Victoria's trained eye, honed from years working as a social worker, detected details others might miss. The closet door was indeed open, but what drew her attention was the baseboard along the far wall. There were fresh scratches marring the paint, and when she knelt to examine them closer, she discovered tiny fragments of plaster embedded in the carpet. Standing up, she pressed her palm against the wall and felt it give slightly, accompanied by a soft crunching sound. Her heart raced as she realized this section of the wall was thinner than it should be, as if something lay hidden behind it. Michael Parker, the building's maintenance supervisor, arrived shortly after Victoria's call. A grizzled man in his late 50s with decades of experience in construction and property management, he listened intently as she explained her findings. His expression grew increasingly grave as he examined the wall, running his fingers along the edges of the baseboard. Without saying a word, he fetched tools from his maintenance cart and began carefully removing sections of the wall paneling. The drywall came away easily, almost too easily, revealing a narrow cavity behind. What they discovered in the hidden space defied immediate comprehension. Packed tightly within the cavity were dozens of small objects wrapped in yellowed newspaper, each bundle tied with twine. The air that escaped as Michael opened the first package carried the same metallic smell Victoria had detected earlier. Inside was a collection of personal items, a child's necklace, a set of house keys, a driver's license belonging to someone named Sarah Mitchell. Each successive package contained similar artifacts, all meticulously preserved, but clearly taken from different individuals over many years. The realization hit them simultaneously. They had uncovered evidence of something far more sinister than either had imagined possible. The discovery triggered a chain reaction of events that consumed the lives of everyone involved. Local authorities descended upon the building, forcing residents to evacuate, while forensic teams worked around the clock. Victoria found herself unable to leave, drawn back daily to witness the investigation unfold. She learned that the building had been constructed in the 1920s and had changed hands numerous times throughout its history. Previous tenants had reported strange occurrences, sounds behind walls, unexplained shadows, sudden temperature drops, but these complaints had always been dismissed as typical of older buildings. What no one had suspected was that someone had been using the building's hidden spaces as a repository for stolen memories. As detectives cataloged the items, patterns emerged that chilled even the most seasoned investigators. Many of the victims had disappeared without a trace, their cases eventually classified as cold files. Some had vanished decades ago, while others were more recent. The oldest item dated back to 1947, a silver locket containing a photograph of two young girls, while the newest was a smartphone manufactured only 3 years prior. The collection spanned generations, suggesting that whoever had been operating behind these walls had maintained their activities for nearly 75 years. The implications were staggering and raised questions about how such systematic predation could have gone unnoticed for so long. Daniel's disappearance added another layer of complexity to the case. Security footage from the building's lobby showed him returning home the previous night, but never leaving again. His car remained parked outside, and his personal belongings were still in the apartment. The only clue was a set of muddy footprints leading from his bedroom to the hidden cavity in the wall, prints that matched his shoe size exactly. Investigators theorized that he might have stumbled upon the collector in the act and become another victim, but without physical evidence, they couldn't confirm this theory. Victoria became obsessed with understanding the pattern behind the disappearances. She spent hours poring over police reports, cross-referencing dates and locations with historical weather data. A disturbing trend emerged. Nearly all the abductions had occurred during heavy rainstorms, particularly in spring when the days were shortest and visibility poorest. The timing suggested premeditation and intimate knowledge of both the building's layout and the routines of its occupants. Whoever had been collecting these artifacts understood human behavior well enough to predict when people would be most vulnerable. The building itself seemed to become more active as the investigation progressed. Residents who had lived there for years reported hearing strange noises at night, thumps and scrapes that echoed through the walls. The heating system developed inexplicable malfunctions, causing rooms to alternate between freezing and sweltering temperatures. Maintenance workers refused to enter certain areas alone, claiming they felt watched even when no one else was present. Most disturbingly, several people reported seeing fleeting shadows move across walls where no source of light could account for them. Forensic examination of the hidden cavity revealed additional horrors. Deep gouges marred the wooden framework, and analysis showed traces of human tissue embedded in the splinters. Blood spatter patterns suggested violent struggles had taken place within the confined space, though the lack of bodies complicated efforts to reconstruct specific events. The collector had apparently used the cavity as both storage and execution chamber, creating a macabre shrine to their crimes. Experts noted that the care taken in preserving each artifact spoke to a deep psychological pathology, possibly rooted in trauma or obsession. Detectives identified a potential suspect through painstaking research into the building's ownership history. A man named Edgar Thompson had purchased the property in 1946 and managed it until his death in 1982. Records showed he had lived in the very apartment where Daniel had resided, and multiple former tenants recalled rumors about strange noises emanating from his unit. However, Thompson's involvement raised more questions than answers, given that items continued to appear in the cavity long after his passing. This suggested either complicity from subsequent owners or that someone else had taken up his dark legacy. Victoria's investigation took a personal turn when she discovered her own grandmother's name among the list of missing persons. Margaret Evans had vanished in 1963 while visiting Anchorage, leaving behind only a hotel receipt and unanswered questions. The revelation shook Victoria to her core, transforming her professional interest into something far more visceral. She found herself spending nights in the vacant building, sitting in the empty apartment, and listening to the walls breathe with secrets that refused to remain buried. Spring gave way to summer, but the rain continued to fall in Anchorage, as if nature itself mourned the atrocities uncovered in the old building. The investigation expanded beyond municipal boundaries as connections emerged between missing persons cases across Alaska. Detectives identified a network of similar hidden spaces in other buildings throughout the state, each containing its own collection of stolen lives. The scale of the operation suggested coordination among multiple individuals, raising the possibility that what had begun as one man's obsession had evolved into something far more organized and dangerous. One night, while Victoria sat alone in the apartment, she heard a sound that froze her blood. From behind the newly repaired wall came the unmistakable creak of footsteps, slow and deliberate. She grabbed her phone to call for help, but found no signal in the suddenly dead zone of the building. The footsteps grew closer, accompanied by the soft rustle of fabric brushing against wood. Then came a voice, barely audible but unmistakably human, whispering words that made her skin crawl. "You shouldn't have looked. You shouldn't have seen." The voice sounded ancient, yet familiar, carrying echoes of countless voices absorbed over decades. The police response team arrived 20 minutes later, bursting into the apartment with weapons drawn. They found Victoria unconscious on the floor, her phone shattered beside her. Paramedics determined she had suffered a severe panic attack but would recover. Yet when they examined the wall where she claimed to have heard the voice, they discovered something that defied explanation. Fresh scratches marred the newly installed drywall, forming words that spelled out a single chilling message: "Not done yet." The marks were too high for anyone to reach without assistance, and security cameras showed no one entering or leaving the apartment during the crucial time period. As weeks turned into months, the case remained unsolved despite mounting evidence. The building was eventually condemned, deemed structurally unsafe due to unforeseen damage discovered during renovations. Residents scattered to different parts of the city, but many reported feeling eyes upon them in their new homes, especially during rainstorms. Victoria returned to her work as a social worker, but found herself constantly looking over her shoulder, certain that whatever had operated in those walls continued to watch from the shadows. The last anyone saw of Daniel Harris was captured by a traffic camera 2 blocks from his apartment on the night he disappeared. The footage showed him walking briskly through the rain, occasionally glancing over his shoulder as if pursued. His image blurred momentarily, then reappeared moving in the opposite direction, though no one else appeared in frame. When enhanced, the video revealed something impossible. His reflection in a storefront window showed him reaching toward the camera with an expression of pure terror, though his physical form continued walking away. The file remains archived, awaiting technological advances that might explain the anomaly. Today, the building stands empty on the outskirts of Anchorage, its windows boarded up and its doors sealed with official notices. During heavy rains, passers-by claimed to hear faint whispers emanating from within, voices overlapping in desperate pleas for help. Local authorities maintain regular patrols of the area, though officers assigned to these duties often request transfers after short periods. The case files remain open, gathering dust in secure archives while waiting for new leads that may never come. And somewhere, in the spaces between walls and beneath floorboards, the collection continues to grow. Mothman warned us before disaster. It was a crisp autumn evening in Point Pleasant, West Virginia, where the air carried a chill that hinted at the approaching winter. The clock read 7:45 p.m., and the sky above was painted with hues of orange and purple as the sun dipped below the horizon. In the small town nestled along the Ohio River, life moved at a leisurely pace, but tonight would be different for the Carter family: Michael, his wife Emily, and their teenage son Jake. Little did they know, an encounter with something extraordinary was about to change their lives forever. The Carter family had gathered in their living room after dinner, settling in for a quiet evening together. Michael sat on the couch reading a newspaper while Emily worked on a knitting project nearby. Jake, engrossed in a video game, occasionally paused to comment on the news stories his father shared aloud. The atmosphere was calm, almost serene, until a sudden gust of wind rattled the windows, startling them all. "What was that?" Emily asked, glancing toward the window. She rose from her seat and approached it cautiously, peering outside into the gathering darkness. Beyond the yard stretched a dense forest, its towering trees swaying gently in the breeze. At first glance, nothing seemed amiss. But then, out of the corner of her eye, she caught a flash of something large and winged soaring silently through the trees. Her breath hitched and she turned back to her family, her voice trembling slightly. "Did you see that?" Michael set down his newspaper, curiosity piqued. He joined Emily at the window, squinting into the distance. For a moment, there was nothing but the rustling leaves and chirping crickets. Then, without warning, the creature reappeared, a massive figure with wings spanning at least 10 feet, its glowing red eyes piercing through the shadows like twin beacons. It hovered briefly before disappearing into the depths of the forest, leaving behind an unsettling silence. Jake dropped his controller, rushing over to join his parents at the window. "What was that thing?" he whispered, his voice filled with awe and fear. Michael shook his head, unable to offer an explanation. None of them had ever seen anything like it before. As they stood there, trying to process what they'd witnessed, a strange sensation settled over them, a feeling of being watched, as though unseen eyes lingered just beyond the tree line. Later that night, as the family prepared for bed, the memory of the winged creature continued to haunt them. Unable to shake the unease, Michael decided to do some research. He retrieved an old encyclopedia from the bookshelf and flipped through the pages, searching for any mention of similar sightings. To his surprise, he discovered references to a legendary entity known as the Mothmanna mysterious creature said to have appeared in Point Pleasant during the late 1960s, coinciding with a series of bizarre events culminating in a tragic disaster. The parallels between those accounts and their own experience were uncanny. The next morning, the Carters discussed their findings over breakfast. They agreed that the Mothman's reappearance couldn't be ignored. It felt like a warning, a sign of impending danger. Determined to uncover more information, they visited the local library where they met Mr. Jenkins, an elderly librarian who had lived in Point Pleasant for decades. His eyes widened when they mentioned the Mothman, and he nodded knowingly. "Ah, yes," he said solemnly. Many people dismissed it as mere folklore back then, but those who paid attention knew better. The Mothman always appears before tragedy strikes. His words sent shivers down their spines, but they pressed him for details. Mr. Jenkins recounted stories of other sightings of people describing the same glowing red eyes, the same silent flight, and the same ominous presence. He also spoke of the Silver Bridge collapse in 1967, which claimed the lives of 46 people, occurring shortly after the last reported sighting of the Mothman. The connection was undeniable, and the Carters left the library with a heavy sense of foreboding. Over the following days, strange occurrences began to unfold around Point Pleasant. Power outages plagued the town, leaving entire neighborhoods plunged into darkness. Strange noises echoed through the woods at night-low growls and haunting whispers that sent chills down the spines of anyone who heard them. Farmers reported livestock behaving erratically, refusing to enter certain areas near the riverbank. And then came the dreams-vivid nightmares plaguing each member of the Carter family, filled with images of collapsing structures and desperate screams. One evening, as the family sat together in the dim glow of candlelight due to another power outage, they heard a deafening screech that reverberated through the air, followed by the sound of flapping wings overhead. They rushed to the window, hearts pounding wildly, and saw the Mothman once again, this time perched atop a nearby telephone pole. Its red eyes locked onto theirs, staring intently as if delivering a final message. Without speaking, they understood the gravity of the situation. That night, the Carters made a decision. Packing only essentials, they left Point Pleasant, seeking refuge in a neighboring town. Days later, news broke of a catastrophic Aventa Major bridge connecting Point Pleasant to Ohio had collapsed under mysterious circumstances, mirroring the tragedy of decades past. Scores of people lost their lives, and the town was left reeling in shock and grief. Though grateful for their escape, the Carters couldn't help but wonder about the Mothman's true nature. Was it a harbinger of doom, or a guardian trying to warn humanity of dangers yet unseen? Whatever the case, one thing was certain: their lives had been forever altered by the encounter. Even now, years later, whenever they hear the distant cry of birds or catch glimpses of shadows moving in the twilight, they pause and remember the glowing red eyes that saved them from disaster. In the end, the Carters learned to live with the knowledge that some mysteries are best left unanswered. Yet, deep down, they remain convinced that the Mothman is still out there watching, waiting, ready to deliver its warnings to those willing to listen. Next story. Where did the Willow Creek campers go? Tents found. No bodies. The forest was quiet when I arrived. Too quiet. The kind of silence that makes your skin crawl, like it's waiting for something to happen or someone to notice you're there. My name is Eleanor Carter, and I'm not a professional investigator. I don't wear trench coats or carry magnifying glasses, but I do have an insatiable curiosity about things most people would rather forget. And this case, this disappearance, had been gnawing at me since the day I first heard about it. It all started with a group of friends, 6 in total, who decided to spend their weekend camping in Willow Creek, a remote forest nestled deep within the Appalachian Mountains, known more for its isolation than anything else. It wasn't exactly a tourist hotspot, but it did attract adventurers looking for solitude. Or so they thought. Days after they vanished without a trace, rangers discovered their campsite intact, tents still standing, fireside embers glowing faintly as if someone had just walked away. There were no signs of struggle, no blood, no bodies, just eerie emptiness stretching out before us like an unsolvable puzzle. I joined the investigation not because I wanted answers, but because I needed them. For weeks, I pieced together fragments of information from locals, park rangers, and even some of the missing campers' families. What I uncovered chilled me to my core and left me questioning whether anyone should ever set foot in Willow Creek again. Willow Creek has always been shrouded in mystery. Even before the disappearances, stories whispered through the towns surrounding the forest spoke of strange lights flickering between the trees, voices calling names that weren't yours, and shadows moving where none should be. Some claimed it was cursed, others believed it housed spirits bound to the land by ancient rituals long forgotten. Whatever the truth, one thing was certain: Willow Creek didn't take kindly to visitors. The group of campers consisted of 4 men and 2 women, all in their late 20s. They were experienced outdoorsmen, well-prepared, and equipped with modern technology designed to keep them safe. Their plan was simple: hike into the heart of the forest, pitch their tents near a small clearing, and enjoy the tranquility of nature. Or so they thought. On the morning of their departure, a local ranger named Harold warned them against venturing too far into the woods. "You hear those stories," he said, pointing toward the dense canopy overhead. "People go in, but sometimes they don't come back." The campers laughed it off, dismissing his caution as folklore meant to scare tourists. Little did they know how right Harold would turn out to be. 5 days later, panic erupted when neither phone calls nor text messages reached the group. Concerned family members contacted the authorities, sparking a full-scale search operation. That's when the rangers found the campsite, or what remained of it. When I arrived at the scene, the air hung heavy with unease. Rangers had already cordoned off the area, marking boundaries with fluorescent tape that seemed almost garish against the somber backdrop of towering pines. As I stepped closer, the details began to sink in. 3 tents arranged neatly in a semicircle, a fire pit surrounded by charred logs, and supplies scattered haphazardly around the perimeter. Everything appeared untouched, as though time itself had frozen in place. But where were the campers? Why had they abandoned everything behind? No signs of struggle, Detective Markson muttered under his breath, crouching beside the remnants of the fire. His voice carried a note of frustration mixed with disbelief. No footprints leading away from the site. It's like they just disappeared. I knelt beside him, examining the ground closely. Sure enough, the soil bore no imprints beyond the immediate vicinity of the campsite. No scuffed boots, no dragged branches, nothing. It was as if the earth itself had swallowed them whole. As we explored further, another anomaly came to light. Every single electronic device belonging to the group lay abandoned nearby. Phones, cameras, GPS units all left behind, despite being essential tools for survival in such a remote location. Stranger still, several devices contained corrupted files, fragmented photos showing blurred shapes lurking at the edges of frames, audio recordings filled with static, punctuated by guttural whispers, and video footage that cut abruptly mid-action, leaving behind only black screens. One clip stood out in particular. Taken during the second night of their stay, it showed the group gathered around the fire, laughing and joking as flames danced merrily in the darkness. Then, suddenly, chaos erupted. Shouts echoed through the speakers, followed by hurried footsteps retreating into the woods. After that, the screen went dark. When playback resumed moments later, the camera angle shifted inexplicably, focusing on a cluster of trees bathed in an unnatural green glow. Before anything else could be seen, the recording ended. "What happened here?" I whispered, replaying the footage over and over, hoping to catch some clue hidden in plain sight. But each viewing only deepened the mystery. Local legends provided little comfort as I delved deeper into the history of Willow Creek. According to one tale, a hermit once lived deep within the forest centuries ago. Known simply as the Watcher, he was said to guard secrets buried beneath the earth's secrets best left undisturbed. Those who ventured too close often returned changed, haunted by visions of faces carved into bark or lights drifting silently among the trees. Another story told of a woman who wandered into the woods seeking solace after losing her child. She never returned, but villagers swore they could hear her cries echoing through the valleys on moonless nights. Some even claimed to have seen her silhouette etched against the horizon, searching endlessly for what she had lost. These tales might sound like mere superstition, but when placed alongside the evidence at the campsite, they took on a sinister new meaning. Could the campers have stumbled upon something they weren't meant to find? Or were something that found them instead? To test these theories, I organized a small expedition into the forest myself, determined to retrace the campers' steps and uncover whatever force had claimed them. Alongside me traveled two fellow investigators, Sam, a seasoned tracker with years of experience navigating wilderness terrains, and Dr. Emily Chen, an anthropologist specializing in indigenous folklore. Our journey began uneventfully enough, following the same trail used by the missing group. At first, the forest seemed benigna, picturesque expanse of verdant foliage swaying gently in the breeze. But as hours passed and twilight descended, the atmosphere shifted subtly yet unmistakably. The chirping of crickets grew louder, almost deafening, while the rustling of leaves became rhythmic, mimicking footsteps trailing behind us. "It's just the wind," Sam insisted, though his hand hovered near the knife strapped to his belt. Still, doubt crept into our minds, fueled by subtle inconsistencies in the landscape. Certain paths seemed deliberately obscured, as though nature itself conspired to mislead travelers. And then there were the symbol-scriptic carvings gouged into tree trunks along the way. Swirling patterns resembling eyes stared back at us, their origins unknown, but their intent clear. We were being watched. By the third night, exhaustion weighed heavily upon us. We pitched camp in a secluded glade, lighting a modest fire to ward off the encroaching chill. Conversation dwindled quickly, replaced by uneasy silences punctuated by distant howls reverberating through the shadows. None of us dared sleep deeply, fearing what might awaken while we rested. Around midnight, Emily gasped sharply, jerking awake with wide, terrified eyes. "Did you hear that?" she demanded, clutching her flashlight tightly. "Hear what?" I strained my ears, catching faint murmurs carried on the wind. Words spoken in a language I couldn't identify, yet hauntingly familiar. My heart pounded as realization dawned I'd heard those syllables before, embedded within the corrupted audio files recovered from the camper's devices. Sam grabbed his rifle instinctively, scanning the darkness for movement. "Stay calm," he urged, though his voice trembled slightly. "It's probably animals." But we both knew better. Animals didn't whisper. Animals didn't call names. Hours later, just as dawn broke over the treetops, we stumbled upon a shocking discovery. One of the missing campers, stumbling blindly through the underbrush, muttering incoherently. His clothes were torn, his face gaunt and pale, as though he hadn't eaten in days. Yet his presence raised more questions than answers. How had he survived when the others hadn't? And why did he refuse to meet our gazes, staring fixedly past us as though seeing ghosts? "Where are the others?" I pressed, kneeling beside him. He flinched violently, recoiling as though burned. "They're gone," he rasped, clutching his head. "All of them, gone." Before he could elaborate, a low growl rippled through the forest, sending shivers down my spine. Turning slowly, I glimpsed movement beyond the tree-lined shapes shifting inhumanly, their forms indistinct yet menacing. And then, silence. That was the last time I saw Sam or Emily. One moment they were standing beside me, weapons drawn and ready to fight. The next, they were gone, swallowed whole by the shadows. I called out frantically, receiving only echoes in response. Panic clawed at my chest, urging me to flee it, which direction led to safety. Clutching my flashlight like a lifeline, I pressed onward, driven by desperation and dread. Hours or perhaps minutes passed in limbo until I reached a clearing bathed in an otherworldly luminescence. At its center stood a massive oak tree, its trunk adorned with carvings identical to those we'd encountered earlier. Beneath it lay a collection of objects, photographs, journals, personal belongings, all belonging to previous victims of Willow Creek. Among them, I spotted something chilling, a photograph taken mere seconds ago depicting me standing alone in the clearing, except I hadn't taken it. The phone responsible lay discarded nearby, its screen cracked and lifeless. A cold breeze swept through the clearing, carrying with it the scent of decay. Behind me, laughter bubbled up a sound, both familiar and alien, resonating with malice. Spinning around, I froze, unable to tear my gaze away from the figures emerging from the darkness. They wore masks carved from wood, their eyes hollow pits reflecting nothing. Each step they took sent vibrations coursing through the ground, shaking the very foundations of reality. I tried to run, but my legs refused to obey, rooted firmly in place. Their leader stepped forward, raising a hand adorned with rings, bearing the same swirling designs etched into the trees. "You shouldn't have come here," it intoned, voice layered with countless others. "Now you belong." And then, darkness. Search parties combed the forest for weeks afterward, finding no trace of me or anyone else who entered Willow Creek that fateful night. Some say I'm still out there, trapped in limbo between worlds. Others claim I escaped, but chose to remain silent about what truly happened. Whatever the truth may be, one fact remains undeniable. Willow Creek claims its victims quietly, methodically, ensuring no one leaves unchanged. If you ever find yourself near its borders, heed the warnings of locals. Turn back, run, because once you cross its threshold, there's no turning back. And if you hear whispers in the dark, remember this. They're not asking for help. They're inviting you home. Next story. Creepy factory ghosts encounter during night shift. Factory ghosts in the dark. I used to think that night shifts were boring. Lonely? Sure. Quiet? Definitely. But boring. That was the whole appeal. No managers breathing down your neck, no coworkers interrupting your flow, just you, the machines, and time moving slowly. At least, that's what I believed until I took the job at Harlan Steelworks. The factory was built back in the 1940s and had barely been updated since. The entire building groaned like an old man every time the wind hit the walls. Flickering lights, rusted metal, faded safety posters from decades past, everything reeked of age, and something else I couldn't place at first. I was hired through a temp agency. They needed someone to cover the overnight shift after one of the workers abruptly quit. No details were given, just he left mid-shift and didn't come back. I should have seen that as a red flag. But I needed the money, and the guy on the phone said it was easy work. Just monitor the furnace temperatures. Make sure the conveyors don't jam. Log activity in the binder near the main control panel. That's it. No heavy lifting, no tools, no one to talk to. Easy. My first night started at 10:00 p.m. The factory was about 30 minutes outside town, surrounded by nothing but cornfields and mist. I remember how quiet it was when I pulled into the lot. No other cars. Just mine and the long, low building stretching into the dark like a sleeping beast. I had to buzz myself in. No guard, no receptionist, just a keypad and a red button. Inside, the air was thick with dust and oil. The only light came from a few flickering overheads. The silence was so complete, I could hear the hum of the fluorescents like they were whispering directly in my ears. I found the control panel and checked the binder. The previous shift had signed out at 9:55. No notes, no warnings, just initials, KL. That name would come back to me later, in the worst way. The first 2 hours were uneventful. I made my rounds, logged temps, stretched my legs. The machines weren't running maintenance, apparently so it was just me and the silence. Around midnight, things started to feel wrong. It began with a loud clang from the far end of the conveyor line. I froze. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't a creaky pipe. It was deliberate, like someone had kicked a metal drum. I called out, "Hello? Anyone there?" No response. I grabbed the flashlight hanging by the panel and walked toward the noise. The beam cut through the dark like a knife. I passed rows of dormant machinery, their surfaces slick with oil and grime. Everything looked undisturbed. But then, at the end of the corridor, just past the hydraulic press, I saw movement, a figure darting between machines. I nearly dropped the flashlight. "Hey!" I shouted, trying to sound firm. "You're not supposed to be here!" Still nothing. I picked up my pace, turned the corner. No one. But I swear I heard breathing, labored, ragged breathing, right behind me. I turned fast. Just empty space. I tried to shake it off. Told myself my eyes were playing tricks, maybe a rat, maybe my own reflection. But the dread didn't leave. It clung to me like cold sweat. I returned to the control panel and tried to refocus. Logged another temperature check. But when I glanced at the binder, something had changed. Under the last log entry, someone had written, You shouldn't be here. I stared at the words, my mouth suddenly dry. I hadn't written that. I was alone. I tore the page out and shoved it in my pocket, told myself maybe it had been there the whole time, and I just hadn't noticed. But I didn't believe it. Around 2:00 a.m., the intercom crackled to life. A garbled voice said, "Help, down here." My stomach turned. There wasn't supposed to be anyone else in the building. I grabbed the flashlight again, hands shaking. "Who is this?" I asked. "Where are you?" Static. Then again, "Trapped, please." I followed the sound toward the maintenance sub-levelan area I hadn't been told about. The stairs were narrow and slick with moisture. The deeper I went, the colder it got. At the bottom was a long hallway lit by red emergency bulbs. I moved slowly, every step echoing like a gunshot. The voice came again. "Don't leave me here." I turned the corner. The hallway ended at a massive steel door marked Furnace Room B. It was ajar. I pushed it open. The heat hit me like a wave, but the room was empty except for a single charred hard hat resting in the center of the floor. The name etched into it? K.L. The worker who'd left mid-shift. Or, rather, hadn't left at all. I backed out of the room, heart hammering. That's when the door slammed shut behind me. I screamed and banged on the door, but it wouldn't budge. Then the whispers began. At first, it sounded like steam hissing from the pipes. But then I heard words. "We never left." "Join us." "Burned, but not gone." The lights dimmed. Shadows stretched across the walls, writhing like they were alive. I turned in circles, flashlight trembling. And that's when I saw them. Figures emerging from the darkness, half-formed, their bodies blackened and twisted. Faces melted, eyes hollow. They moved slowly, dragging themselves toward me with jerky, unnatural movements. I screamed, ran. I don't remember how I escaped the sublevel. Somehow, I made it back to the control panel. I grabbed my keys, my bag, and bolted out the front door into the rain. When I looked back, the lights in the factory windows were all off, except one, up on the second floor. And in that window, I saw a silhouette watching me. It raised a hand and waved. I quit the next day, didn't ask for my paycheck, didn't tell the agency what happened. A week later, I saw a news article. Temporary worker vanishes during night shift at Harlan Steelworks. A new guy, hired to cover my old spot. They never found him. And the factory? Still operational. Still hiring. But some nights, when I'm driving past those cornfields, I swear I see smoke rising from the roof. And if I roll down the window, I can still hear the whispers. We never left. Do you believe in ghosts now? Because I didn't. Until I met them.
Next story. The small town that forgot it existed. I never thought I'd stumble into something so unnatural. It started with a whisper, really a story passed down through hushed conversations and forgotten diaries. A town erased from existence. Not just physically, but mentally, as if it had never been there at all. The kind of tale you dismiss as folklore until you find yourself standing on its threshold. My name is irrelevant now. I've tried to hold on to it, but the harder I grasp, the more it slips away like sand through my fingers. All I know is that I was drawn here by curiosity, or perhaps something darker, an urge to uncover what should remain buried. This place, this small town that forgot it existed, it calls to those who dare look too closely. Let me take you back to where it all began. It was late autumn when I first heard about it. I was in a bar, one of those dingy little holes in the wall where the patrons seem older than the building itself. The bartender mentioned it almost offhandedly while wiping down a glass already clean enough for surgery. "Ever hear of Eldon Hollow?" he asked, his voice low, conspiratorial. Eldon Hollow. The name rang hollow in my ears as though it carried some weight I couldn't yet understand. I shook my head, prompting him to lean closer, his breath warm against my ear. "They say it's a ghost town," he whispered, "but not the kind with tumbleweeds and skeletons. No, this place, it's alive. People still live there. They just don't remember anything." He stopped then, letting the words sink in. My pulse quickened, not out of fear, but fascination. What kind of town could exist like that? How could people forget everything, their names, their families, even the concept of time? "Where is it?" I pressed, unable to mask the eagerness in my tone. The bartender smirked, leaning back as though satisfied with my reaction. "That's the thing," he said. "You can't find it unless it wants you to." And yet, somehow, I did. The drive to Eldon Hollow felt endless. My GPS flickered and died halfway there, replaced by static-filled silence. Maps showed nothing but wilderness where the town supposedly lay. But I kept driving, guided by instinctor, maybe something else entirely. When I finally arrived, it was dusk, and the air smelled faintly of earth and decay. At first glance, Eldon Hollow seemed ordinary. Rows of quaint cottages lined narrow streets, their windows glowing softly with lamplight. Smoke curled lazily from chimneys, carrying the scent of wood smoke. Children played in the street, laughing without abandon. Couples strolled arm in arm, their faces serene. Yet beneath the surface, something wasn't right. I parked near the edge of town and stepped out, my boots crunching on gravel. Immediately, I noticed them, the townsfolk. They moved like automatons, performing mundane tasks with mechanical precision. A woman swept her porch despite the absence of dirt. A man watered plants that didn't need watering. Their movements were precise, deliberate, but devoid of purpose. And their eyes held no spark, no recognition. No one acknowledged me as I walked past. Not a glance, not a word. It was as though I didn't exist. Curiosity overrode unease, and I pushed deeper into the heart of Eldon Hollow. The main square was eerily quiet, save for the ticking of a massive clock tower looming above. Its hands spun wildly, defying logic. One moment it read 3:17 p.m., the next midnight, then noon again. Time meant nothing here. A shopkeeper stood behind his counter, arranging jars of preserves. He looked up as I entered, his expression blank. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice monotone. "I'm looking for information," I replied cautiously. "About the town, about why it feels so strange." The shopkeeper tilted his head, confusion flickering across his face before smoothing over. "Strange?" he echoed. "This is Eldon Hollow. There's nothing strange about it." "But..." I hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. "Don't you notice? The clocks? The way people act?" His brow furrowed slightly as though struggling to comprehend my meaning. Then he smiled a brittle, forced smile and said, "Maybe you're tired. Traveling can do that to a person. Why don't you stay the night? Rest your mind." Before I could respond, he turned away, resuming his task with robotic efficiency. I lingered for a moment longer, unsettled, before stepping back outside. As the hours passed, the oddities multiplied. At the bakery, I watched a young girl repeatedly stack and unstack loaves of bread, her actions mechanical and repetitive. Across the street, a barber shaved the same customer over and over, each stroke identical to the last. Conversations faltered mid-sentence, speakers staring blankly ahead as though searching for words that refused to come. Time stretched thin here, warping and twisting like taffy pulled too far. Minutes dragged into hours, days blurred into weeks, yet no one seemed to notice or care. Life in Eldon Hollow was a loop, a perpetual cycle of meaningless motion. By evening, I sought refuge in the local inn, hoping to piece together what I'd witnessed. The innkeeper greeted me warmly, though her smile lacked warmth. She introduced herself simply as Mrs. Harper, offering little else. Her memory, like everyone else's, appeared fragmented. She couldn't recall how long she'd lived in Eldon Hollow or even where she'd come from. "You must be new," she observed, setting a tray of tea on the table. "Most visitors don't stay long." "Why's that?" I asked, sipping the bitter liquid. She paused, considering. "Because they realize they don't belong here," she said finally. "This place, it changes you, makes you forget." Forget. The word hung heavy in the air, resonating with ominous implications. Forget what? Who? Why? That night, sleep eluded me. Shadows danced along the walls, cast by unseen lights. Outside, the wind howled, mournful and insistent. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked incessantly, its cries echoing through the empty streets. I sat up, clutching the blanket tightly, and stared out the window. The moon hung low in the sky, blood-red and distorted. Beneath it, figures moved faceless silhouettes drifting aimlessly through the darkness. They weren't human, not anymore. Whatever remained of their identities had been stripped away, leaving behind shells of flesh and bone. What force drove this madness? Was it natural or supernatural, or worse, man-made? Answers came slowly, pieced together from fragments of conversation and discarded objects. An old journal found tucked beneath a loose floorboard spoke of experiments government-funded studies conducted decades ago. The entries grew increasingly erratic, filled with warnings of loss and void. One passage stood out. They promised progress. Instead, they took everything: memories, identities, souls. Progress, void. The words echoed in my mind, intertwining with visions of shadowy figures cloaked in lab coats, injecting syringes into unwitting subjects. Had Eldon Hollow been a test site? A laboratory disguised as a community? Or was something older, darker at play, some cosmic entity feeding on identity, consuming the essence of humanity like prey? The latter explanation sent chills down my spine, yet it fit the surreal atmosphere better than any scientific rationale. Evidence mounted as I explored further. In the church basement, I discovered photographs yellowed snapshots of smiling families, children playing, couples embracing. None of the current residents recognized themselves in these images. To them, the past was a void, a black hole devouring all traces of who they once were. In the schoolhouse, dusty yearbooks sat abandoned on shelves, pages flipped open to reveal portraits of students whose names were scribbled out, replaced by question marks. Teachers gazed stoically into the camera, their expressions vacant. Even the dates were smudged, unreadable. Somewhere deep within the labyrinth of memories and mysteries, I began to suspect the truth. Eldon Hollow hadn't always been this way. Once, it had Triveda bustling hub of life and culture. Then, something happened. Something catastrophic. Days or perhaps weeks passed in a haze. My own grip on reality weakened as I delved deeper into the town's secrets. Faces became familiar, yet unfamiliar. Voices whispered in my ear, urging me to join them, to let go of my burdens. One morning, I woke to find myself standing in front of a mirror. My reflection stared back, distorted and wrong. My hair had grown longer, my skin paler. Lines creased my forehead, etched deep by stress and uncertainty. Most disturbing of all, my eyes, they mirrored the emptiness I'd seen in the townsfolk. Had I started forgetting too? Panic set in as I realized the truth. Eldon Hollow wasn't just affecting its inhabitants, it consumed outsiders as well. The longer I stayed, the more pieces of my identity slipped away. Names, dates, places all reduced to ash in the furnace of oblivion. Desperate, I attempted to leave, but the roads twisted and turned, leading me back to the center of town. The clock tower loomed ever-present, its hands spinning faster, louder, drowning out rational thought. Buildings shifted positions overnight, creating mazes of alleyways and dead ends. Escape proved impossible. And then, the twist. While rummaging through an abandoned house, I uncovered a photograph tucked inside a drawer. The image showed a younger version of myself, arms wrapped around a group of friends. Behind us stood the unmistakable silhouette of the clock tower. I froze, staring at the photo in disbelief. How could this be? If I'd been here before, if I'd been part of Eldon Hollow? The realization hit like a freight train. I wasn't just a visitor, I was one of them. Time collapsed in on itself after that. Days blended into nights, minutes stretched into eternity. The townsfolk welcomed me back not with joy, but with indifference. Another soul reclaimed by the void. Another fragment added to the collective amnesia. Now, as I sit alone in the inn, penning these final words, I feel the pull of forgetfulness tugging at my mind. Names slip from memory, faces blur, emotions fade. Soon, I won't remember who I am or that I ever was. Will you find this journal? Will anyone believe the tale of Eldon Hollow, the town that forgot it existed? Or will it vanish again, swallowed whole by the abyss? All I know is that the clock keeps ticking, faster, louder, closer. And soon, it will claim me too.
The room that breathed. Boston stirred under the weight of another spring morning, the air thick with a peculiar warmth that seemed misplaced for the season. Daniel Harris stood on the cracked sidewalk outside number 17 Marlborough Street, his fingers tracing the edge of an old brass key in his pocket. The building before him loomed like a forgotten sentinel, its red brick facade darkened by decades of Boston winters and neglect. Across the street, Victoria Evans leaned against her parked car, arms crossed tightly across her chest as she watched Daniel approach the entrance. The neighborhood was waking up slowly, curtains twitching in nearby windows as residents observed the newcomers. Michael Parker emerged from the alley beside the building, his camera slung around his neck, capturing the uneven angles of the structure with professional precision. "This place gives me the creeps," he muttered, though his lens stayed trained on the upper floors, where shadows seemed to move independently of the rising Sunday. Daniel's footsteps echoed hollowly as he climbed the worn stone steps to the front door. The wood beneath his feet felt spongy, yielding slightly with each step. He paused at the threshold, glancing back at his companions. Victoria gave him a tight smile while Michael adjusted his camera settings, seemingly oblivious to the faint scraping sound coming from somewhere deep within the building. The key turned with unexpected ease, revealing a vestibule that smelled of damp paper and something else. Something metallic and sharp. Inside, the air was unnaturally still, as if the house itself was holding its breath. Dust motes hung suspended in shafts of weak morning light that filtered through grimy windows. To their left, a staircase spiraled upward into darkness, its banister wrapped in layers of peeling paint. Directly ahead, a hallway stretched toward the rear of the building, lined with doors that seemed to lean inward as if drawn by some invisible force. The wallpaper, once elegant, now peeled away in long strips that curled toward the floor like dead leaves. Victoria's heels clicked against the hardwood as she moved to examine a series of framed photographs hanging crookedly on the wall. Her fingers hovered above the glass but didn't touch. "These pictures," she began, her voice dropping to a whisper. In each frame, people stood stiffly posed, their eyes fixed on something just beyond the camera's view. What disturbed them most was the background. Through windows behind the subjects, they could see the same room appearing in every photograph, its details shifting subtly but unmistakably present in each era depicted. Michael joined her, his camera clicking softly as he documented the unsettling gallery. "That's impossible," he said, pointing to one particular image. "Look at the dress styles. These photos span nearly a century, but that room." His voice trailed off as he noticed something moving in the corner of the frame. When he looked up, the hallway appeared empty, yet the sensation of being watched pressed heavily against his skin. The temperature dropped suddenly, causing their breath to mist in the air. From somewhere above came the distinct sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, pacing back and forth across the ceiling. Daniel called out, his voice echoing unnaturally loud in the confined space. The footsteps stopped immediately, followed by complete silence that seemed to vibrate through the very walls. Then came a new sound, a soft, rhythmic creaking like the gentle expansion and contraction of old wood. But this wasn't coming from the structure itself. It was emanating from the room at the end of the hall, pulsing with a life of its own. Daniel took the first step toward the source of the sound, his palm slick against the railing of the staircase. The wooden steps groaned beneath his weight, each complaint sounding louder than the last. Halfway up, he paused, certain he'd heard whispered words trailing after him like cobwebs brushing against his ears. Victoria followed close behind, her hand occasionally reaching out to steady herself against the wall, only to pull back sharply each time her fingers made contact. The wallpaper felt warm to the touch, almost feverish, and when she looked closely, she thought she saw veins of black mold spreading outward from each point of contact. At the top landing, they found themselves facing 3 doors, each painted a different shade of gray that seemed to shift depending on how long you stared. The middle door stood slightly ajar, swaying gently, despite the absence of any breeze. Through the gap, they could see movement, not human movement, but something more akin to shadows stretching and retreating across the far wall. Michael raised his camera, framing the scene through the viewfinder, but what he saw through the lens made his hands tremble. The room appeared larger through the camera, its dimensions distorted in ways that defied logic. "Did you hear that?" Victoria's voice cracked as she spoke. They all froze, listening to the sound of breathing, deep, measured inhalations that filled the corridor like waves crashing against a distant shore. The sound wasn't coming from them. It was too synchronized, too deliberate. Daniel reached for the doorknob, his fingers brushing against metal that felt impossibly cold. As his hand closed around it, the breathing hitched, then resumed with greater intensity. The door opened with a reluctant creak, revealing a space that seemed to swallow the available light rather than reflect it. Inside, the air was dense and humid, carrying the scent of earth after rain mixed with something sour and metallic. The walls were covered in what appeared to be ancient wallpaper, but upon closer inspection, they realized it was actually layers of dried, yellowed paper stacked directly onto the plaster. Pages upon pages of handwritten text, fragments of letters and drawings pressed together like geological strata. Some sections seemed to ripple when touched, as if the surface retained some vestige of life. In the center of the room stood an antique writing desk, its surface stained with ink blots that had long since dried black. Victoria approached the desk cautiously, her attention drawn to a leather-bound journal resting open at its center. The handwriting inside was spidery and erratic, the ink varying in color from fresh black to faded brown. As she read the first few lines, her reflection in the window behind the desk caught her eye. She froze, watching as her mirrored self continued reading even after she had lowered the book. The reflection smiled at her, then mouthed words that didn't match her own movements. When she turned to look back at the actual room, she found Daniel staring at her with wide eyes, his lips moving soundlessly. Michael remained in the doorway, his camera trained on the scene unfolding before him. Through the viewfinder, he watched as the room's dimensions shifted imperceptibly, walls bowing inward, then snapping back like living tissue. The floorboards beneath his feet pulsed gently, maintaining the same rhythm as the breathing they had heard earlier. He noticed something new. Symbols carved into the baseboards, their shapes disturbingly familiar. They matched the patterns he had seen in the photographs downstairs, though here they seemed more pronounced, almost angry in their execution. The room grew darker despite the approaching noonday sunday. Shadows lengthened unnaturally, pooling in corners and creating shapes that suggested movement just beyond perception. A soft scratching sound began behind the walls, like fingernails dragged lightly across wood. It started in one corner, then traveled methodically around the perimeter of the room, gaining speed and intensity with each circuit. The breathing deepened, becoming labored, until it sounded like someone struggling for air. Yet no living person occupied the space with them. Daniel moved toward the far wall, drawn by an inexplicable force. His fingers brushed against the paper-covered surface, feeling the individual sheets shift under his touch. Some pages crumbled to dust at his slightest contact, while others felt slick and wet, leaving dark stains on his fingertips. He realized with growing dread that the papers weren't merely covering the wall, they were growing from it, sprouting like fungal growths in the dim light. Words formed and reformed before his eyes, sentences rearranging themselves into coherent paragraphs that told stories of lives lived and lost within these walls. The breathing changed pitch suddenly, becoming higher and more rapid. The room responded physically, its walls expanding outward, then contracting violently. Books fell from shelves that hadn't been there moments before, their pages fluttering like wounded birds. The desk in the center split down the middle, revealing a cavity stuffed with more paper, all bearing the same frantic handwriting. Victoria stumbled backward as the journal in her hands began to burn, not with fire, but with a cold light that seared her palms without leaving marks. The reflected version of herself in the window had disappeared completely, replaced by something darker and less defined. Michael's camera flashed repeatedly, capturing images he couldn't see with his naked eye. Through the viewfinder, he watched shadowy figures emerge from the walls, their forms distorted but somehow familiar. They moved with purpose, gathering around the edges of the room like spectators at a performance. Their faces remained indistinct, but their presence pressed against his consciousness like a migraine building behind his eyes. The symbols on the baseboards glowed faintly, their light pulsing in time with the room's breathing. A sudden gust of wind swept through the space, though none of the windows had opened. Papers swirled in miniature cyclones, settling randomly across the floor in patterns that suggested meaning. The breathing grew ragged, punctuated by wet, gurgling sounds that made Victoria cover her ears with both hands. She sank to her knees as memories flooded her mind, memories that weren't hers. Faces of strangers flashed before her eyes, each accompanied by a surge of emotion so intense it brought tears streaming down her face. Pain, loss, despair, each sensation more vivid than anything she had experienced in her own life. Daniel found himself drawn to the farthest corner of the room, where the wall seemed to pulse more noticeably than the others. His hands moved of their own accord, tearing at the layers of paper until he exposed bare wood underneath. Carved deeply into the surface were names, hundreds of them, overlapping and intertwining like roots. Some he recognized from the photographs downstairs, others were unfamiliar but carried the same weight of tragedy. As he traced his fingers over the names, he felt them respond, the wood warming beneath his touch and the letters seeming to rearrange themselves into new configurations. The room's breathing became erratic, gasping now as if fighting for survival. The walls contracted violently, forcing everyone toward the center. Papers flapped like trapped birds, their whispers building into a cacophony of voices speaking in languages none of them understood. The symbols on the baseboards burned brighter, their light casting everything in harsh relief. Michael's camera died suddenly, its battery drained despite being fully charged that morning. Still, he kept pressing the shutter button, hoping to capture something of what he saw through the viewfinder, shapes moving just beyond the threshold of visibility. Victoria screamed as the floor beneath her feet gave way, not collapsing, but opening like a mouth hungry for sustenance. She fell forward, catching herself on hands that sank partially into the wood as if it had become liquid. The journal's cold light spread across her arms, illuminating veins that seemed to contain flowing ink rather than blood. Memories continued to assault her mind, each one bringing physical pain that made her whole body convulse. The reflected version of herself returned in the window, reaching out toward her with hands that passed through the glass as if it were water. Daniel tore at the wall faster now, his fingers bleeding as he clawed deeper into the wood. With each name he uncovered, the room reacted more violently. The breathing became wheezing, punctuated by wet coughs that sprayed droplets of something dark against the remaining intact wall. The uncovered names began to glow, their light joining with that of the symbols on the baseboards until the entire room shimmered with an otherworldly radiance. Shapes moved within the walls themselves, pressing against the surface from the other side like creatures trying to break free. Michael retreated to the doorway, his legs shaking as he watched his friends struggle against forces they couldn't comprehend. Through his useless camera, he saw the truth of the room laid bare. A massive, beating heart at its core, pumping darkness instead of blood through veins of corrupted wood. The symbols served as valves, regulating the flow of whatever malignant force inhabited the space. The photographs downstairs weren't just documentation, they were warnings, each one showing the room consuming another victim who had come too close to understanding its nature. The breathing stopped suddenly, leaving a silence so profound it hurt their ears. The room held its collective breath, waiting. The walls began closing in, not quickly, but inevitably, their movement accompanied by the sound of thousands of pages turning simultaneously. Victoria pulled herself free from the floor, her arms streaked with black ichor that evaporated into smoke before hitting the ground. The journal's light had consumed her shadow, leaving her outlined in negative space. She joined Daniel at the wall, helping him tear away the remaining paper in a desperate attempt to reach whatever core lay hidden beneath. As they worked, the room showed them its true face. The walls weren't solid, they were composed of compressed memories, each layer containing the essence of someone who had tried to understand or escape. Faces pressed against the surface from the other side, their mouths open in silent screams that vibrated through the very bones of the building. The symbols on the baseboards merged into a single pulsing sigil that dominated the floor, its light so bright it burned away the darkness entirely. The heart at the room's center beat once, twice, then exploded outward in a wave of energy that threw them all backward. When they opened their eyes again, they found themselves standing outside number 17 Marlborough Street. The building looked different now, newer somehow, its bricks clean and its windows reflecting the afternoon sun without distortion. A young couple walked past them, discussing plans to renovate the upstairs apartment. Daniel reached into his pocket for the brass key, but found only lint. Michael's camera hung heavy around his neck, its memory card wiped clean. Victoria's hands bore no marks, though she could still feel the phantom burn of ink-filled veins beneath her skin. They never spoke about what happened inside the room. Each carried their own piece of its secret, buried deep where it couldn't consume them completely. Sometimes, late at night, Daniel would wake to the sound of breathing coming from his closet. Michael developed a habit of taking long detours to avoid walking past 17 Marlborough Street. Victoria found herself drawn to old journals and letters, unable to resist the urge to document everything she encountered. The room had marked them, claimed part of their essence, and though they had escaped its physical confines, its influence followed them like a shadow that refused to dissipate. Weeks later, during another unseasonably warm spring morning, a new set of tenants moved into the building. They marveled at how well-preserved the old place was, how the upstairs apartment seemed to breathe with a life of its own. In the main bedroom, they discovered an antique writing desk with a leather-bound journal resting open at its center. The first tenant to touch it felt a surge of inspiration so powerful it brought tears to her eyes. She began writing immediately, her pen moving across the page with a will that wasn't entirely her own. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying with it the faint sound of pages turning and the gentle, measured breathing of something that had waited patiently for new voices to add to its collection. Don't just watch in the dark, click subscribe, like, and join now. Before we begin, tell me, where are you listening from and what time is it there? The Book That Called Me. The streets of Chicago were slick with rain, reflecting the dim orange glow of streetlights like shattered mirrors. It was 5 in the morning, and the city seemed to hold its breath under a heavy sky streaked with gray clouds. The storm had rolled in from Lake Michigan without warning, drenching everything in sight. Victoria Evans stood on the corner of Wabash Avenue, clutching her coat tighter around herself as she waited for the traffic light to change. She hated mornings like this, cold, wet, and eerily quiet, but her job at the library demanded punctuality. Victoria worked at Harold Washington Library Center, a towering structure that loomed over South State Street like some ancient sentinel. The building's glass facade shimmered faintly in the pre-dawn gloom, catching the occasional flash of lightning that lit up the horizon. As she approached the entrance, her shoes squelching against the wet pavement, she noticed something odd, a single book lying face down on the steps leading up to the main doors. Its cover was dark, almost black, and water pooled around it in tiny rivulets. No one else was around. The security guard, who usually manned the early shift, hadn't arrived yet. She hesitated for a moment before picking it up. The book felt heavier than it should have been, its pages damp but not entirely soaked through. There was no title on the spine or cover, just an embossed pattern of swirling lines that seemed to shift slightly when viewed from different angles. A shiver ran down her spine, though she couldn't say why. Maybe it was the way the book felt. Alive somehow, pulsing faintly in her hands. Still, curiosity got the better of her. She tucked it under her arm and pushed open the heavy glass door. Inside, the library was silent except for the faint hum of fluorescent lights overhead. Rows upon rows of shelves stretched out into shadowy corners, their contents neatly organized, yet somehow foreboding in the dim light. Victoria made her way to the circulation desk near the center of the atrium, setting the book down carefully, as if afraid it might bite. Her fingers lingered on the cover for a second longer than necessary before she pulled them away abruptly. Something about it unsettled her deeply, though she couldn't put her finger on what exactly it was. Her co-worker, Daniel Harris, arrived shortly after, yawning loudly as he shuffled toward the desk. He was tall and lanky, with messy brown hair that stuck out in all directions despite his best efforts to tame it. "Morning, Vic," he muttered, glancing briefly at the book before shrugging. "What's this?" "I found it outside," Victoria replied, keeping her voice low so as not to disturb the stillness. "It doesn't have a title or anything." Daniel raised an eyebrow but didn't comment further. Instead, he reached out to touch the book, his hand hovering above it for a moment before making contact. His expression changed instantly from mild curiosity to outright alarm. "Whoa, this thing is freezing." Victoria nodded, though she hadn't thought much of the temperature earlier. Now that Daniel mentioned it, the air around the book did seem colder, almost unnaturally so. She watched as he flipped it open cautiously, revealing blank pages that looked yellowed with age despite being completely dry, or at least they appeared blank at first glance. When Daniel tilted the book slightly toward the light, faint words began to emerge, written in ink that shimmered like oil slicks. They weren't English or any language Victoria recognized, but the shapes, twisted and writhed